Okay, you ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
Let's go live. There we are.
Hey everyone, welcome to this this fortnight's installment. A little bit of whiskey talking there, I think.
Yeah, maybe you should hit the water.
Welcome. We're doing Shiraz today. We're doing the Shiraz trilogy.
Yes, so a little bit of a masterclassy kind of talk. A little bit about Shiraz, but also a little bit about what it means to be ripe
Indeedly doodly.
in the wine world.
Indeed. So this is a weird masterclass. This is an interesting masterclass. This is looking at a horizontal of Shiraz. So vertical is the same grapes from the same vineyard in different years.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a horizontal. So this is the same grapes from the same vineyard in 1 year. One.
So how does that work? How do you do that?
So basically, you have 3 wines in front of you. If you're tasting with us, you have 3 wines in front of you. 1, 2, and 3. Number 1, the Shiraz was picked on day X. Number 2, the Shiraz was picked on day X plus 3 weeks. And number 3 is day X plus 6 weeks. So bear in mind, these are the same grapes from the same vineyard, about 7 kilometres away from the winery, a small vineyard on Reese Road in Ballindine. And there are about 15 rows of Shiraz.
Yep.
And so basically, number 1 was picked from 5 rows, number 2 from 5 rows, number 3 from the last 5 rows. So we're looking here at the concept of ripening.
Absolutely. I just noticed Dan's comment down in the chat there. This is the ultimate wine nerd's wine. And that's exactly what it is. This is a totally academic experiment that we did in the winery and in the vineyard, and we thought the results were interesting enough that we would actually bottle it like this and sell it as a trilogy of Shiraz.
Yeah. So we, in this winery, have a philosophy of our house style of wines, I suppose we can call it. You know, a lot of people don't realise, with the Granite Belt being one of the coolest areas in Australia to grow grapes, we don't grow those big, buxom, ripe grapes. You know, so our Shiraz is more akin to Rhone Valley.
Yes.
So more medium-bodied than heavy-bodied.
If you've been watching some of our others, you would have noticed that we often make or draw parallels between the Granite Belt and the Rhone Valley. We have similar styles and we have a lot in common in terms of weather patterns, warm, sunny days and cooler nights that help us to create these balanced, elegant, maybe slightly more spicy, cool climate styles of Shiraz, or what some people might often refer to as Syrah, as opposed to some of your more traditional Aussie styles.
So when we decide how to pick our grapes, or when to pick our grapes, we use a particular technique called berry sensory analysis.
So what does that mean, berry sensory analysis, and where does it come from?
Well, so it came from a particular researcher, and I can never remember her name.
You always call her Anna Winter.
Yeah.
But she's not. She's Erica Winter.
Ah, damn.
It's not The Devil Wears Prada.
Why not? That would be pretty cool. Could you imagine this woman walking around in Prada in a vineyard?
I don't know. I've never met her. I don't know if she could pull it off.
Well, she's quite Germanic. So,
maybe.
You know, she's tall too. Anyway.
So Erica Winter was working with the University of Montpellier, where this kind of idea was originally born, I suppose. And kind of she worked with them to parlay this into a more Australian viticulture-oriented format.
Yeah. And so basically what you look at is you look at all these different characteristics of the grape, of the rachis, of the stems, how the grapes are attached as a bunch. You look at the skins, pips, flavour, everything.
Should we have a look?
Let's have a look.
Here's one we prepared earlier.
Hey peeps, we're out here in the vineyard and you can see it's winter time. There's no leaves on the vines. It's certainly not a time to pick some grapes. So we're going to do a grape analysis with some table grapes. Come to the winery and I'll show you what we do. So basically when we analyse the grapes, when we determine when it's time for them to be picked, we have to look at a lot of different parameters. So we use a particular system called berry sensory analysis. And you can see this beautiful table here. This table notes down all the different characteristics that we look at when we're looking at how ripe the grapes are. So at the moment, I've got some big table grapes. And these table grapes are about 4 times the size of a wine grape. Look how big these grapes are, crazy. So the parameters that we look at what the berry looks like, we look at what the pulp looks like, the skins, and the seeds. So the first thing we do is we check to see what the conditions of the berries are like, whether they're hard or soft, and what sort of colour they are. We also try and work out how difficult it is to take the berries off of the rachis. And you can see here, as I'm taking these berries off of the rachis, that sometimes you can get a bit of pulp, and sometimes you don't. You get these little paintbrush filaments. So this bunch is quite ripe. You also look at the condition of the rachis, what colour it is, and what the condition is like. Once you've got your sample of grapes and you peel a grape, and you can see here how we peel this grape, and they're pretty difficult to peel, particularly when you don't have nails like me. Pretty difficult. Anyway, you can see here how the pulp is green, even though this is a red-skinned grape. And so remember, when you're making red wine, all of the colour and the texture of red wine comes from fermenting on skins. Once you've peeled the grape, you have a look and see what the condition of the skin is like. Is there any pulp that's left on the underside of the skin? Chew the skin. Oh, bitter. Have a look and see what the condition of the skin is like. Was it hard to chew? What did it taste like? Ugh, bitter. Then you get this. Then you get the pulp, and then you suck the pulp off of the seeds. But this is a seedless grape. Bam, boom. It's a table grape, no seeds. But anyway, you're supposed to suck the pulp off of the seeds and see how difficult it is to suck that pulp off. Oh, that's not a very nice thing to say, is it? Anyway, take that one back. You look at the skins, and then if you've got the seeds, then you crunch the seeds. Pretend I'm crunching the seeds. Is it bitter? What sort of taste it is, etc., etc. Then, once you do that, you press the grapes. And we've got a little basket press here. A little example of what a basket press looks like. and you try and get some juice out of the grapes. And you can hear it squishing away, and you can see that grape juice coming out. You can see it coming out there. We've got some grape juice here from before. We measure not only its acid, and we don't have a pH meter here, so we would do that usually in the lab, but this is where we also measure the sugar. Let's have a look and see how much sugar content is in this grape juice. And we use that via hydrometry. So this is a hydrometer, and this juice is about 10 Beaumet. In fact, it is 9.8 Beaumet. So that's about 180 grams per litre of sugar. Lots of analysis to make sure if your grapes are ready to harvest. We're back.
So that was actually, believe it or not, that was the short version of how we do a BSA, because normally when we do one of those, we take samples from the whole vineyard. So we will pick bunches, multiple bunches from every row in the whole vineyard. We will then pick grapes in a pattern off those bunches to come up with a big bowl of single berries. And then we will randomly select 20 berries. So imagine what Glen just did, repeated 20 times.
So when we do analyze one vineyard, it takes about a half a day to actually physically analyze it and also chemically analyze it as well. So we didn't show you how we measure the pH. We didn't show you how we measured the TA, the titratable acidity. That's what we do all in the lab. So
yeah.
Takes a long time.
We thought the video was long enough without showing you those really, really exciting things that we do afterwards.
Anyway, did we get to try this wine?
Yeah, all right.
All right.
I haven't finished my whiskey yet. But...
Oh, well, I have. I'm thirsty. Okay, wine number 1. What did we call it?
Terroir.
Terroir. Okay. Wine number 1 is our, I suppose, house style of wine. So when we did this exercise, we wanted to see if we were interpreting the berry sensory analysis system, the technique, to our best advantage. We wanted to see if we were getting it right for our taste. So it was all about trying to see how confident we are in picking the optimum time of ripeness for our grapes.
Yeah, because there's always a window of ripeness. There's a time when the grapes are definitely unripe. Then from that point, and this is when we start doing the BSA, is probably, when we think the grapes are 2 or 3 weeks away from being ready, we start to do the BSA, which is actually quite unpleasant when you're tasting skins and seeds and pulps of unripe berries. It's not terribly pleasant work. But it's the idea that we keep filling out this grid again and again and again. And I have a picture of the grid that might give you an idea. So if you have a look at this, we have those different categories that Glen mentioned, where there's the berry, the pulp, the skin, and the seeds. And we have a list of kind of different attributes that we look at. And then the main body of the grid there has all these different descriptors. So it's kind of like this qualitative, quantitative hybrid where there's 4 different, I suppose, levels of ripeness. So as we move from the left to the right, we are getting riper and riper as we move across. So when we do the first BSA 2 or 3 weeks before we think the grapes are going to be ready, we are very much over on that left-hand side. If you look at the very first thing there, which is the softness of the berry, the first on the left says hard. When the berries are hard, they're definitely unripe. And then they move through elastic, which is where you squeeze them, but they spring back. Next off, there is plastic, which is where you squeeze them and they maintain that squished shape. And then you just get soft, slushy berries. So as we're moving across, we're getting riper and riper. So if we do this process 3 weeks out and then 1 week out, and then when we think it's ripe, we end up with this snapshot. And what you see is that the parts that we color in as we go are moving across the page from unripe to more ripe. So it gives us a really kind of nice visual interpretation of what's going on.
And it sort of takes the guesswork, or tries to take the guesswork out of determining when the optimum time is to pick your grapes. So, yeah.
So wine number 1 was picked at the beginning of what we would consider the window of ripeness, which is typically where we like to pick, being a cooler climate. As I said, we have these lovely warm days and lots of sunshine, which is great for getting the grapes ripe from a flavor perspective. But then we have these cool evenings that start to kind of come in around mid-February, which gives us time. It gives us time for flavors to get ripe before sugars get ripe. So the grapes kind of ripen along 2 different sets of parameters.
The thing is as well, one of the reasons why number 1 is our house style is that in general, our wines have mouth-watering natural acidity. We like that sort of sensation in the mouth. We feel that freshness of acidity, that little bit of that watering of the sides of your tongue is going to be palate cleansing. That's going to get your mouth ready for the next bite of food that you're going to eat. So we believe that these less alcoholic, less intense, more sort of natural acidic type of wines are more thirst quenching and basically better for food.
Absolutely. It's that idea that, sometimes you have these wines that are so rich and generous that you get 2/3 of the way through a glass and you just kind of get bogged down in the wine, and it's like, just give me something else. Give me some soda water or some champagne. I just need bubbles and acid, something lively to get this heaviness off my palate. Whereas when you make wines that are moreish, you have that juicy acidity, and it's kind of like you finish the first glass and you're reaching for the bottle before you've even noticed it. And that's certainly something that we aspire to.
Before we continue to wine number 2 as well, I'd like to add that all these 3 wines are made in the same way. They're made with a small amount of new oak.
Well, wine number 3 has no new oak.
Yeah, that's true.
Apart from that.
1 and 2 are basically the same. About 25% of new oak, a mixture of French and American oak. We felt that wine number 3 didn't really need new oak, and we will come to that wine later.
Yes.
So let's go to wine 2.
Okay.
Wine 2, as I said, was picked 3 weeks later than wine 1. So what you see here is you definitely see these wines are related. You know, that the fruit profile seems to be the same. The big thing is, though, number 2 has got a much higher alcohol.
Much higher alcohol, and whilst it has the same fruits in it, the nature of the fruits has changed. So whereas in the first wine we had those kind of crisp, slightly tart, juicy, just right kind of fruit flavors, when we come into wine number 2, We're starting to get riper flavors. We're starting to head towards maybe some slightly confected flavors or some slightly kind of cooked or jammy flavors as we have the influence of more heat and more ripeness coming in to that wine. So as Glenn said, very much the same flavor profile, but a different kind of, well, I guess a different level of ripeness in those flavors.
A different finish as well, you know, and I feel that number 1 truly reflects the granite belt, whereas number 2 looks like it could have come from the Barossa.
Which is why wine number 1 is called terroir, which means a sense of place, and wine number 2 is called tradition, in that it is more of a classic Aussie Shiraz.
Yeah. And I think, you know, then you've got to decide as winemakers, you know, do you decide to produce a wine that is a true expression of your place, you know, a wine with a sense of place that is going to reflect your vineyard? Or are you going to make something that is potentially going to be more commercial?
Well, this is the really interesting thing. Coming into this project, that's exactly how I would have described it, in that wine number 1 tells the story of who we are, what we do, where we are. And I would have said that wine number 2 was probably the wine that had more commercial appeal. But I'm surprised how many people still prefer wine number 1.
And I think that's also a change of people's tastes. I think a lot more people are just a little bit tired of those really, really big meal in a glass type of wines, and they're looking more at, you know, something that they can enjoy longer, you know, have more than a glass, maybe have a glass and a half, maybe have 2 glasses.
And still be able to drive a car.
Yeah. So when you compare wine number 1 to wine number 2, let's have a look, reaching over to the bottle. Wine number 1 has an alcohol of 12.9, and wine number 2 has an alcohol of 14.2. And those stated alcohols are actual alcohols. We've got a good laboratory, so where we tend to be truthful about our alcohol percentages. In Australia, we have this 1.5% leeway. So people can declare that their wines might be 14.5% alcohol, but legally they can still be 16%.
And when you talk about some of the warmer climates in Australia, they quite often are.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I think if you were in Dan Murphy's and you picked up a bottle of wine from a particularly hot climate and saw that it was 16%, you'd go, oh, no, too overblown, too much. If I open up this bottle of wine, I'm really only going to be able to drink a glass.
So given that we have 2 Shirazes side by side, made with very much the same winemaking, apart from that ripeness of fruit spectrum, what difference does the alcohol make to these wines? How does wine number 2 taste different to wine number 1 as a result of the alcohol?
The first thing I would say is wine number 1 is moreish.
Mm-hmm.
And that, for me, that is the most important thing. That without even thinking about what's different between 1 and 2, the first thing that I would say is that I would go back to 1 because I feel that it's more of a drinkable wine. So that's the most important thing for me.
Mm-hmm. Bearing in mind Glen is an acid freak, so that needs to be taken with a grain of salt.
As well, wine number 2 is, I think, quite hot in the palate. As well, it's heavier on the palate. It's got this real weight to it. Some people love that. Some people absolutely love that. And it's interesting, and I don't, no, I will generalize here. I was going to say I won't generalize, but I will generalize here. Older people tend to enjoy wine number 2 more than wine number 1 because older people are more used to drinking those quintessential Aussie reds.
It's what they grew up on.
That's what they grew up on, and when it comes to us as Australians drinking more wines these days, as we've become a more affluent society, as we've become a more foodie society, I think Australians are looking more towards food-friendlier wines, and I think wine number 1 is, for my palate, more food-friendly.
Which is a great opportunity to plug what we're going to do in 2 weeks' time, which is a masterclass on food and wine matching. So we'll talk about more about that later. But yes, it just seemed an opportune moment to mention it.
Segue.
So I just wanted to touch on this idea of hotness because it's a word that we feel is very self-descriptive, but it may be a little confusing to some of you out there. So it's literally this feeling of warmth when you think about drinking a nice brandy or a scotch or, the kind of spirit that you sip neat or on the rocks. You get it in your mouth and you swallow it and you have this warming feeling that travels down your throat. And it's a really pleasant feeling. There's nothing negative about it. And that is exactly what you get from wine number 2 that you do not get so much from wine number 1. And Sean mentioned, I think, in one of the comments that 1.5% alcohol seems like a really big leeway. Bearing in mind it's plus or minus 1.5, which means it's actually a 3% gap where the wine is going to fall somewhere into. And, 1% alcohol makes a huge difference to the palate, weight, flavor, and effect of a wine. So, it's, I think it's really noticeable in these wines, which are about 2% apart.
Yeah. Dan had a very interesting question. What do we consider as older people, older consumers? I would probably say over 40, 45.
I'd be less inclined to put a number on it and just say that, there are people who kind of grew up with the tradition of, the Barossa Barons. It's, we're talking about the Grant Burge, Wolf Blass, Peter Lehman kind of days of Australian wine, as opposed to the generation that has followed. And there's a phrase that I like to use, which is not my dad's beer. And I think there's a second generation, and probably we're even starting to get into a third generation away from those barons of the Barossa, where the new wave of consumers doesn't want to drink the same thing that the last generation drank. So, rather than age, it's probably more of a generational kind of idea.
Yeah, but it generally is age. Well, that's a generation, isn't it?
It is, but I mean, you're almost lumping me in there with those people who grow up on older classic Australian big Shiraz.
So what? Own your age. Big deal.
But I didn't grow up on that.
Anyway, wine number 3. Let's go to wine number 3. So as I was saying beforehand, all of our alcohol levels, all of our declared alcohol levels...
It's not exactly true.
I said were absolutely real. Well, it's not exactly true. The only wine that we've ever lied about is wine number 3. So we declared this as 16.9 alcohol. And in actual fact, it's 17% alcohol. I couldn't quite come to terms with putting a 7 on the bottle. It was just like, it was too confronting.
So how does that even happen? How do you get a wine to 17% alcohol without fortifying it, without adding any alcohol to it whatsoever?
So the yeast that we used to make this wine was a very efficient converter of sugar to alcohol. Often yeast dies at around 16.5% alcohol. You know, when you consider the process of fermentation, fermentation is all about yeast converting sugar into carbon dioxide and alcohol. So when the yeast is producing alcohol, it's sitting in its own excrement. Ugh.
Really classy way to describe it.
Well, it's waste, isn't it?
It is, though. Okay.
So anyway, alcohol is very toxic to yeast.
And to just about every other living organism on the planet.
Exactly. And so therefore, you know, as the wine increases in alcohol, yeasts are slowly but surely becoming poisoned by the ever-increasing alcohol. Usually by 16.5% alcohol, the yeasts will die. But this yeast that we used, and I can't remember if it was a commercial yeast or not. I'd have to have a look at the notes.
It must have been one of those champagne yeasts, those workhorse yeasts that are just bulletproof.
It just kept going. The interesting thing about these grapes, when we finally harvested them, they were shriveled. Mm-hmm. A lot of them looked like sultanas. And what happens when grapes are like that, they not only concentrate sugar, but they also concentrate flavors as well. So this is a huge wine. This is a very, very flavorful wine.
I think it's also worth noting that there's one more thing that was concentrated in this wine, which is acid. So, you know, as the water is removed from the grape by evaporation through the skin, you get this concentrating of solid matter. And the solid matter is made up of the skins and the seeds and what we call the phenolic components. It's also made up of the sugar, which is why there's this funny thing that happens where wine number one seems tart and juicy and acidic in a really nice, moorish, refreshing way. Wine number two has more of that generosity about it because a lot of the acid has been lost through the ripening process. But then you come over to wine number three and suddenly the acid is back again. And it's not because we added a truckload of acid. It's actually because what acid was left has been concentrated by the fact that we actually lost 30% of the water out of this wine.
Yeah, and hence the reason why when you look at the trilogy, you've got the first two bottles at 750 mils, the last bottle at 500 mils.
Exactly 66% of the first two.
And that sort of represents the loss in hydration of those grapes since they've been sort of sitting there on the vines for such a long time.
So for Sean, who asked the question about Amarone and our skin contact, this is very much in that style where we have literally let the grapes raisin, but instead of doing it on racks in the Amarone style, we actually let this happen on the vine because 2015 was very generous to us in terms of weather, so we actually had the opportunity to do this experiment.
Yeah, it was a great year, and we were lucky enough to be able to look after that vineyard that had so many rows of Shiraz. It's like, oh, what are we going to do? What are we going to do to have a cool experiment? Mm-hmm. And so, ta-da! Hence the trilogy. For me, you know, wine number one and wine number two, and thank you, Leo, for asking what sort of foods we would have with these wines. Wine number one and wine number two I would have with the main meal, and, you know, you'd have a big steak, some big red meat, heavy, slow cooked meat. Wine number 3, I would have with maybe a cheese board with dried fruits, maybe even some bitter chocolate would be fun.
Absolutely. I mean, Amaronian chocolate is an amazing thing. It has to be bitter, dark chocolate. If you put it with sweet chocolate, it's not going to work so well. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, by the time we get to a wine like this, we're looking at the kind of alcohol levels and the kind of concentration that you would expect to find in a port-style wine.
Yep.
The only difference is this wine has much less sugar than a port-style wine would. But you can definitely think about the same kinds of matches, just with less sugar.
Yeah. Ta-da! Do we have anything else to talk about?
I don't know. Are there any questions?
Let me have a look. Oh, so
Jack is shaking his head. No one's asking questions.
Oh, well, that's good. That we've got an early leave pass. That means so. For next masterclass, we're going to do some food and wine matching. We haven't quite decided on the 3 wines. Have we decided on the 3 wines, Jack? Oh, Andrew, go for it.
I think we have. We decided Chardonnay.
Yep.
Because Chardonnay is just ubiquitous.
Yep.
We decided on Rosso. So we're going to do a classic Northern Italian Nebbiolo Barbera blend because the Northern Italians know a little bit about food and wine and how they go together. And then we thought we would revisit the Botrytis Sauvignon Blanc as a very, very interesting wine to pair with food.
Yeah. So I have a little side project which we're calling Cooking Charmaine, and it's all about Charmaine Solomon's Asian cookbook. And because I'm 60% Asian, we are very obsessed with Asian food. So Charmaine Solomon's original Asian cookbook is a Bible of, 300 odd pages of all these recipes spanning from Korea and Japan, Northern Asia, through to China, Southeast Asia, and then on to the subcontinent. So there are some amazing recipes in there. Myself, Jack's wife Chandni, and a couple of friends are attempting to cook the whole book. And so maybe we are going to match some interesting Asian recipes with these wines.
You need to find a Charlie in the group so you can call it Charlie and Charmaine.
Charlie and Charmaine.
Doing a Julie and Julia.
Okay, we'll try. So when are we going to tell people what sort of food we're going to cook? Am I going to have to?
You have to decide first.
Okay, so shall I do it tomorrow? I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow.
Very quickly, there's a question from Dan. Would you do something like the trilogy again, given the chance?
Absolutely. Look, I think we did this with Shiraz. I think it'd be really interesting to do with a white as well, really.
Yeah, or Tempranillo.
Tempranillo would be fantastic, because the thing is, for example, we have the 2016 Reserva Tempranillo, which is for sale now, and it's one of our most popular wines. We make a Joven Tempranillo every year. But this 2016 was the only time where we thought that the grapes deserved to have a Reserva treatment. And so, not often are vintages wonderful, 2015 was great, 2016 was great, 2017, but the great thing about 2017 not being a good vintage was that your skills as a winemaker hopefully comes to the fore, and that you're still going to make good wines. So, you need to be true to the conditions of the vintage. You need to be true to the vintage and make the best wine you can in a vintage. And you've got to make wine in what is a bad vintage.
I think the linchpin word in Dan's question is chance. Given the chance, we absolutely would love to do this project again, but you really need a special set of circumstances to allow this kind of thing to happen. Also, very sadly, we no longer have access to the vineyard where these grapes came from. So we would need to find another local source of Shiraz where we could sink our claws in and exert control over it to be able to do an experiment like this.
There is a particular patch of Tempranillo that we've always coveted. And the 2016 Reserva came from this very, very sought after vineyard. It's only 300 meters that away, and we have lost the pleasure of using those grapes. But
lost is a very passive word. That's not how I remember it going down.
Anyway, I had an altercation with the grower. He wasn't playing well. And anyway, we need to repair those relationship bridges before we can do an excellent experiment with Tempranillo. And we will do that one day.
We'll get there.
Maybe when he's dead. Anyway. What?
I don't really have a response for that. So, 2 weeks' time, fortnightly, as always, we will be doing our masterclass in food and wine pairing. We will be looking at 3 of our wines, Chardonnay, Nebbiolo Barbera blend, and Botrytis Sauvignon Blanc. And just for something fun and challenging, because Asian food is always such a challenge, we will be trying to pair these wines with recipes from Charmaine Solomon's Asia cookbook, which is one of the pan-Asian housewife staples of Australian kitchens across the country.
That's me, pan-Asian housewife. We'll see you next in the next 2 weeks.
2 weeks' time, the 10th of September.
And we'll be in our kitchen. And we'll be cooking.
Okay.
Yeah, why not?
This is news to me.
Yeah, we'll be in our kitchen.
Okay.
We'll be cooking. And you'll be able to meet Ahan and the family. Sounds like fun.
Absolutely.
All right.
We'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
All right, bye.